Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today we're talking about fan art. It's impossible to exist within fandom spaces without not just seeing fan art, but also seeing the impact it has on the communities that it's made for. Through its creation, fans are able to express their love and passion for their favorite media in a way that not only brings them joy, but also creates something new and unique of their own in the process. Existing characters are brought to life and reimagined in new ways that aren't bound by the limits of canon, allowing artists to tell new stories with them and see them in ways that they never could have otherwise. Like Fyodor from Bungo Stray Dogs and a panda hat as a completely hypothetical example. He'd never wear that in canon, but thanks to fan art, that doesn't mean we can't see him in it anyway. More seriously though, fan art has, over time, undoubtedly come to have such a great influence on fandom communities that it practically shapes them, because it allows fans to engage with the media that they love in an entirely new, transformative way. One that brings joy not only to the artists themselves, but also their fellow fans that they share it with. Fan art has been an integral part of fandom since the beginning of fandom altogether, and while the positive impact that it's had is absolutely undeniable, that doesn't mean it's free from controversy. In fact, especially in recent years, as the internet has offered fans a much more accessible way to both share and sell fan art within their communities, there have been many arguments made against it, criticizing everything from its artistic value to its creation and, most controversially, its sale. As someone who's been making, selling, and loving fan art since I started drawing over a decade ago, those criticisms are naturally of great interest to me, since they're not at all baseless or without merit. So naturally, I had to make a video about it. This is one I've been planning for a long time now, but because the ethics surrounding fan art are so complex and nuanced, it's also one that's required a lot of research, since I wanted to be sure I was presenting and addressing them all with as little bias as possible despite being a fan artist myself. Throughout that research process, I read 3 books that I'll be referencing throughout this video and would recommend to anyone interested not only in the ethics of fan art, but the way that fandom has evolved and changed as a whole over time. And they are Artistic License, The Philosophical Problems of Copyright and Appropriation, Fake Geek Girls, Fandom, Gender, and the Convergence Culture Industry, and Fandom 2nd Edition, Identities and Communities in a Mediated World. All 3 are linked in the description, and I really would recommend checking them out, because if this video interests you, they probably will too. So if fan art is such a great aspect of fandom as a whole, then why are so many people critical of the ethics surrounding it? Well, there are 2 groups of fan art critics, those who argue against its sale, and those who argue against its very creation as a whole. Those who argue against its creation generally claim one of 2 things: that it's simply unoriginal and therefore valueless artistically, and that the use of copyrighted characters in fan art may or may not contribute to a changed public perception of the original creator's work, which could be detrimental if the nature of the fan art contributes to a worse reputation for both the fandom and the original creator. Essentially, that the original creator is not being consulted on if and how their characters are being represented, and that it's not right to potentially tarnish those characters' reputations by depicting them in ways that may not be favorable. Those who argue against its sale posit that if the fan artist doesn't own the characters, they don't own the right to sell the art that they make of them, and that in selling it anyway, they unethically set themselves up as market competitors against the original creator. Some also argue that fan artists profit off of the original creator's popularity and not their own artistic merit, presuming that their work would not otherwise have sold based on the fan artist's own merit, quality, or style alone, were it not for the subject matter. That they're buying it for the character, not the art. That subsequently prompts a very controversial debate surrounding whether or not depicting a character from existing media in one's own style is transformative enough to give them the right to sell it, because it forces us to effectively do the impossible and measure exactly how much value comes from the character and how much value comes from the artist's style, interpretation, popularity, and novelty. Novelty in this case referring to how interesting or new the setting they've placed the character in is. Obviously, there's also the legal side of things to consider too, because copyright law is frustratingly vague and unclear when it comes to defining whether or not the sale of fan art is considered to be infringing upon the original creator's intellectual property. Now, because it's different in every country and very legally murky, I won't be discussing whether or not it is currently legal to sell fan art in this video. That is, in my opinion, honestly an exercise in futility. Instead, I'm going to address all of those ethical concerns I just outlined and try to assess, with as little bias as possible, whether or not it should ethically be legal to sell it. To do so, I'll be breaking this video into separate segments, addressing the ethics surrounding the creation of fan art and the nature of originality in art, then addressing the ethics surrounding its sale, and finally concluding whether or not, in my opinion of course, its sale should be legally permitted, and if so, to what degree. But first, let me take a moment to thank the sponsor that made today's video possible, Milanote. Milanote is an incredibly versatile tool that makes organizing creative projects so much easier, something I know that I and many other artists struggle with. Being an artist often means having a million ideas and works in progress and references all over the place, making the artistic process messy, unstructured, and often stressful as a result. With Milanote, you can change that, keeping all of your ideas, inspirations, references, and more all in one place. Look at my board. Using their project plan template, I basically built myself an all-in-one art workstation workstation. Over here, we've got all of the ideas that I have planned for art that I want to draw soon, one of which is a series of Vocaloid album covers. Because that project has a lot of different pieces involved, I gave it its own board on the list, which opens to a list of the specific characters that I want to draw and some style and composition references. Back on my main board, I've also got all of the references I need to draw those ideas neatly compiled so I can access them easily, an inspiration section where I use the mood board template and Milanote's built-in library of stock images to build some aesthetic references for upcoming work, and a resources section for quick links to gather more references if needed. I've also left myself little reminder notes across the board because you can draw right on it and easily drag and drop not just text notes, but columns, lists, links, and more. It's so organized, I feel like I can actually breathe again. With Milanote, you can streamline your creative process and save so much time by organizing your ideas, projects, and resources, and easily share your board with others if you're working with a team. And best of all, it's actually free. Not a free trial, there's no time limit at all. All you have to do is click the link in the description and sign up and start your next creative project with Milanote, because it's genuinely an exceptional tool for anyone, especially artists. Thank you so much to Milanote for sponsoring this video, and again, please go check them out via the link below. Alright, all that out of the way, let's get into the video. Looking at the ethical criticisms of fan art, almost all of them come down to whether or not it's sufficiently original. And we'll get to that, but first I'd like to examine the one criticism that has nothing to do with that at all, fan art's social influence. As I mentioned before, one ethical issue some people have with fan art's creation is that it has the power to influence the reputation of the source material without the original creator's permission or approval, something that could either be to their benefit or to their detriment. In Fandom's 2nd edition, they describe this problem well, writing, "Various types of moral rights allow an author, or an author's heirs, to control the attribution of a work, to withdraw it from circulation, or to protect it from mutilation or distortion by unwanted adaptations or alterations. Moral rights theory posits a deep and unique connection between author and text, such that an insult to the text is an assault on the author. Moral rights thus seem inherently in conflict with fans' willingness to take liberties with source texts." Now, this was in relation to fanfiction, but the point it makes is nonetheless very applicable to visual fan art as well. One could absolutely argue that the original creator of a piece of media should have a right to control how that media is presented, especially when the unauthorized fan adaptations of it contribute to negative outcomes, something that can happen in a variety of ways. Firstly, if certain themes or elements are particularly prevalent in fan art of a series, it could lead those who haven't viewed the source material to believe that those themes are canonically present within it, even when that's untrue. For example, there's so much fan art of Chuya and Dazai from Bungo Stray Dogs that depicts them as romantically involved that I have met a distinctly non-zero number of people who haven't watched or read the series that think they're canonically together. Now, that's a fairly harmless example, but it can become a legitimate issue if fan art of a series frequently depicts problematic or triggering content or views that the source material does not include, because it could lead to people distancing themselves from that community and choosing not to read, watch, or otherwise engage with the original series or work, since they believe it to contain those same themes just because it's present in the fan art. Meaning, too, can be falsely attributed to the original work through frequent fan art depiction in the same way. If everyone draws fan art of a character possessing a trait or belief that they don't canonically possess, a meaning that the original creator did not intend is then applied, at least for those who haven't seen it. Now, I would argue that it isn't the fan artist's fault that people have an increasingly alarming tendency not to fact-check the assumptions that they make about things, and that fan artists shouldn't be held responsible for that, but I do understand why it's a concern. Those false assumptions aren't the only thing affected by fan art's social influence, but also reputation. If a fandom becomes known more for the fan art made based on it than the original work itself, then the reputation of that work can be affected by the public opinion of the fan art. This could be good or bad, but is ultimately not at the original creator's discretion, which is the primary concern with it. Plenty of fandoms suffer poor reputations based on the fact that a significant number of its fan artists draw problematic, suggestive, or quote-unquote cringe art based on it, leaving the original creator to suffer a poor reputation in turn, by no fault of their own, at least in association with that particular work. Interestingly enough, artistic license addresses this phenomenon not as a negative, but rather as something that gives fan art value outside of the original copyrighted subject matter it's depicting, saying, "Focusing on cases in which artists appropriate common, recognizable objects and imagery of popular culture, soup cans, flags, cigarette packages, money, movie stars, comic strips, and even shopping bags, Baden recommends a notion of transformative use, expanded to recognize the allegorical strategy of appropriative art, and so to allow for their fair use. By allegorical strategy, Baden refers to the recontextualization of recognizable images by artists so as to invest those images with new meaning. In the case of appropriation art, Baden suggests that this new meaning takes the form of social commentary. The image gains new meaning, Baden argues, by forcing the viewer to reevaluate her understanding of the image. It is this reorientation of our evaluative practices, she suggests, that makes all art, and not merely appropriation art, valuable. I find this interesting because I believe it addresses the flaw in these criticisms as a whole. The fact that fan art is, when affecting affecting communities this way, for better or worse, social commentary, something that takes many forms far beyond art. Because is this all not the case with any opinion being expressed about any work that's made publicly available? If people discuss a piece of media and share their beliefs about it, even if they end up subsequently misattributing their own meaning where none was intended by the original creator and spreading those beliefs through their words, is that any different than fan art? I would argue that when sharing your work with the general public, you are opening it up to discussion and interpretation that might be wrong, and that fan art is simply one facet of that discussion. It's not at all uncommon for media to generate a reputation based less on the media itself and more on the general behavior of its fans, for better or worse, and that's kind of just an inevitability that must be accepted by creators as a necessary cost of having fans to begin with. Fandom 2nd edition further defends this conclusion by taking the fan artist's intentions into consideration, explaining that fan contributions are rarely intended to be damaging or disrespectful to the original work, but are, by their very nature, created out of subversive respect. Regardless of the outcome, the intention is to express that they enjoyed the original media so much that they wanted to create something inspired by it, and, as the book reads, creation breeds respect for creation. I'd also like to come back to something I've said a couple times now, that the influence fan art can have on the original work's reputation could be for better or worse. We've talked about the worse, but we haven't talked about the better. Creators and companies use fan arts to establish more popularity for their work, just as much as fan artists use the creators' characters to establish their own popularity. In fact, in most cases, the creation of fan art benefits the original creator more than it harms them, even in cases where it also diminishes their work's reputation. All press is, for the most part, good press, obviously with a plethora of exceptions, and more creators and companies are shifting their focus from cracking down on stopping fan content to instead using it as free promotion of their own work. With our shift into a completely social media-driven society, they've realized that not only can they not stop fan art from being created and shared, they benefit from its creation heavily, because their own profits are becoming more and more directly dependent on people talking about it and sharing it online, something that fan art effectively serves as a free marketing method for them to achieve. It's so valuable, in fact, that some of these creators and companies actively encourage it as a result, to a borderline exploitative degree. The biggest offender we see most is the hosting of fan art contests that offer limited prizes, allowing the host to receive hundreds and thousands of entries that function as free promotion of their series or work, only having to offer financial compensation to 1 or 2 winners. That's already way more profitable for the original creator than any of the fan artists participating, and it's not even going into the fact that many of those contests also stipulate that the artists submit their fan art to them directly, a process that often includes agreeing to a lot of shady small text legalese that signs away the fan artist's right to their own work, allowing the creator to use it commercially if they so choose. Fake Geek Girls examines several similar instances of the commercialization of fan art as fan labor that companies are shifting towards, including sites like FanLib for fanfiction that, to quote the book, sought to monetize fan production in exchange for prizes and proximity to media creators that appeared on its surface to be endorsing and facilitating fans' transformative tendencies, but in reality, the site forced fans to give up all rights to their work, and in exchange offered no legal protection if media companies chose to come after fans for copyright infringement. Those are just 2 particularly heinous examples, and most companies and creators don't actively exploit fan artists to that degree, but they do objectively benefit from its creation more than the fan artists themselves do. The original creator gets free promotion for their work without even having to solicit it, whereas the fan artist often gets very little in return for their creation beyond the comparatively lesser engagement derived from their use of those characters in their work. Because while they do get to benefit from having more eyes on their art than they normally would because it depicts a popular character, those eyes are looking less at the art itself and more at the character, so the number of people who see it and decide to follow and support the fan artist rather than just enjoy work of a character they like and scroll right on is low unless they draw a lot of it. So to conclude my response to this particular criticism of fan art's ethics, I would argue that while the creation of fan art can have negative impacts on the creator of the original media, as a result of it contributing to its development of a negative reputation that it would not have had without that fan content, that's simply the nature of any kind of fan engagement and discussion at all, and should be expected if you're sharing your work publicly. Furthermore, the creators of the original works actually stand to benefit more from the creation of fan art than the fan artists themselves. So to conclude that fan art's creation is unethical on those grounds would be, in my opinion, unreasonable. To move on to the debate as to whether or not fan art can be created and sold ethically, as I mentioned earlier, we must first address the claim that it is inherently unoriginal. After all, if it is sufficiently original, it stands to reason that all of the other arguments against it are wrong. If it's original enough to be considered that artist's intellectual property, there is no ethical reason why they shouldn't make or sell it. But to measure the originality of fan art, we have to define what makes any piece of art original, which is incredibly difficult, if not altogether impossible, hence the controversy, I suppose. All art, by very nature of its creation alone, is inspired and influenced by things that already exist, things the artist has seen and done, their experiences and perceptions, and, most notably, the work of other artists. As artistic license reads, artists have copied artists for about as long as there have been artists. Subsequently, originality is a very difficult concept to quantifiably measure. Artistic license goes on to examine this at length, dissecting many notable approaches to that issue, with this passage in particular presenting an interesting concept. Perhaps one of the most quoted lines about unoriginality comes from English clergyman William Ralph Ing. Hope I pronounced that right, I don't think I did. What is originality? Undetected plagiarism. In the context of his essay, appropriately titled Stolen Epigrams, we see a little more. What is originality? Undetected plagiarism. This is probably itself a plagiarism, but I cannot remember who said it before me. If originality means thinking for oneself and not thinking differently from other people, a man does not forfeit his claim to it by saying things which have occurred to others. The first portion of this passage is generally quoted in support of the myth of originality, that all purportedly original works simply reproduce what has come before. But the remainder of the passage suggests that novelty is not what is at issue in originality, at least not the sort of originality that we care about in copyright and plagiarism. Rather, what is at issue here is whether the work owes its origin to its author. Indeed, on Hand's interpretation, this is just what authorship is. This is effectively to say that if it's impossible to create something that isn't inspired by something that already exists, subsequently borrowing from that original source material, then novelty isn't what we should focus on when measuring originality, but intent and origin itself. We should not try to determine whether a piece is altogether new and free of any pre-existing influences, but rather whether or not it could have been created at all without any particular one of those influences. For example, I could draw a portrait of a random original character, and every element of that piece, from the character's traits to the composition to the way it's shaded, would have been inspired by something else. Ideas, memories, photos, references, and works from other artists. However, despite borrowing from all of those sources, intentionally or unintentionally, I still would have arrived at the same or at least very similar final product if any one source of inspiration had not been present, because I borrowed nothing significant enough from any particular inspiration to see any visible difference if it were removed. If I were to draw a portrait of Chuya, like the one you saw in the thumbnail, however, that final piece could not have been created had someone else not already created Chuya. My interpretation was passively influenced by a number of different sources unintentionally, and that would have been the same whether he was my subject or not. But because he was my subject, the piece could not exist if it were not for him existing first. Based on this approach, this would suggest that fan art is not, in and of itself, an inherently original creation. But this doesn't necessarily make it unoriginal altogether. Artistic license suggests that it's less of a black and white, original or unoriginal determination, and more of a scale based on the number of unique artistic choices made on the artist's behalf. It references US law regarding photography copyright, writing, "However, in a 2011 case, the Court of Justice of the European Union determined that a photograph merited copyright protection if it reflected, quote, the artist's personality. That is, quote, if the artist was able to express his creative abilities in the production of the work by making free and creative choices. By choosing such elements as the subject's background, pose, and lighting, a portrait photographer can stamp the work with his, quote, personal touch, and so merit copyright protection." Gauging originality on a scale of how much an artist's personal touch is placed on the source material is, then, pertinent to consider. Have they contributed enough artistic, creative elements to it for it to be considered its own work, independent from the source material? After all, fan art couldn't exist without that source material, but it couldn't exist without the fan artist's own artistic choices either. Artistic license reaches a similar conclusion, defining fan art as sufficiently original works of authorship under the definition of a derivative work. Quote, "A derivative work is a work based upon one or more pre-existing works, such as a translation, musical arrangement, dramatization, fictionalization, motion picture version, sound recording, art reproduction, abridgment, condensation, or any other form in which a work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. A work consisting of editorial revisions, annotations, elaborations, or other modifications which, as a whole, represent an original work of authorship, is a derivative work." In conclusion, if we agree that true originality cannot exist because all art is derived from existing concepts and ideas, it stands to reason that we should instead endeavor not to define it as plainly original or unoriginal, but rather judge it on a scale of how original it is based on whether or not it could exist without the prior existence of a specific one of its inspirations. And if it couldn't, how many of its other inspirations contributed significantly to produce something sufficiently different than that one inspiration, the stamp of the artist's personality, as artistic license put it. So effectively, because fan art couldn't exist without the media that inspired it, but is also being interpreted by another artist rather than simply copied and is subsequently stamped by that artist's personality, fan art is not an original work altogether, but is sufficiently original to earn the fan artist's authorship of it as a derivative work that is still their own. Based on that conclusion, if fan art is original enough to be considered the artist's own work, but not original enough to be able to exist in the first place without the work it was inspired by, the sale of it becomes infinitely more complicated both ethically and legally. To reiterate, I'm not not discussing whether or not it is currently legal, but whether or not it ethically should be. And in my opinion, based on what is effectively a co-authorship between the original creator and the fan artist, there are a number of factors to consider when approaching this dilemma. First, is the fan art being sold in a form that the original creator is already selling their work? Effectively, would the fan merch be a direct competitor for official merch? Artistic License writes, Carlin suggests first that an appropriation artist's commercial interests should not determine a finding of fair use, but rather that the question hangs on whether or not there is a willful interference with another's commercial interests. This is essentially to suggest that it would be ethically problematic for a fan artist to sell their work if they're doing so in a way that would prompt a situation in which a buyer could be placed in a position to choose between buying the fan merch and the official merch. For example, if I'm selling prints of fan art for a series that isn't selling official merch, the sale of my own is not stealing any business from them because they wouldn't have had that business anyway. And if they were, in what form? If I'm selling prints and they're selling posters, that would potentially set me up as a commercial competitor. But if I sold that fan art on t-shirts instead, and they weren't also selling t-shirts, I'm once again just taking business that they wouldn't have had anyway. It only becomes ethically problematic to sell fan art in that regard if you're doing so in a way that could steal the original creator's business by offering your art as an alternative to theirs, especially if you're doing so at a lower price. There is some argument to be had here though about whether or not fan merch is actually viewed as a competitor for official merch at all, and that's where this becomes a little more nuanced. Many argue that potential buyers simply don't view fan merch and official merch as something to choose between, but rather as two entirely separate markets. Even if the creator is selling official shirts, and fan artists are too, their decision to buy the official merch isn't affected by the existence of the fan merch, because the novelty of it being official is what motivates them to want it. They're buying it specifically because it's recognizably official. Fan merch, on the other hand, is usually viewed as desirable on a separate basis, not based on that novelty, but based on the design alone. And if it's a design that is nothing even vaguely similar to what the original creator is selling beyond the character alone, then it is once again just taking business that the original creator already wouldn't have had. That defense would only apply if, as I said, the design isn't ripping off a design the creator is already selling, but is sufficiently unique and original to be considered a derivative work based on the definition that we arrived at earlier. If it doesn't, then it isn't ethical fan art to begin with, and isn't what I'm talking about here. That is, personally, the stance that I agree with, that fan merch, so long as it's not deliberately intended and marketed to act as a direct replacement for existing official merch, is perfectly ethical to sell because it's its own market. That said, it's quite simply impossible to measure how many people, when faced with two different designs of the same character, one official and one fan created, would view them as competitors for their purchase, or as two separate purchases to consider independent from one another. So I understand if others disagree with me on that. I just personally believe that while there are inevitably going to be some instances of the former, the vast majority would agree with the latter. The next consideration to make would be the scale at which it's being sold. Is this a mass-produced rip-off Animal Crossing leaf design being sold to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, on Temu? Or is it a fan-drawn apparel design being sold on an artist Etsy in numbers closer to the tens, maybe eventually hundreds? Is selling massive amounts of fan art the entire basis of their business, or is it just a few items in a much wider inventory of other non-fan art-based designs? The amount of profit actually being made, I believe, is worth taking into consideration when judging the ethical nature of fan art sale, with small-scale operations coming out much more favorably, something echoed by Artistic License. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, the last consideration I would personally make in judging fan art sales ethics is whether or not the creator themselves has stated their preference on it. If a creator or even a company has outright forbidden the sale of fan art, I would deem it unethical to sell it anyway. Whether or not it's ethical for the original creator to forbid it at all, given that fan art is original as a derivative work, is another interesting conversation worth having, but I would personally not feel comfortable disregarding their wishes anyway, regardless. If the original creator has either not expressed a stance or has outright given approval, however, and it meets all of the prior criteria, I would personally give it a free-stamped ethical pass to sell. A lot of people have also argued the relevance of the original creator's size. Is this an individual creator whose work you're selling fan art of, or a large company or production studio? Personally, I don't think it's reasonable to say that that has any bearing on whether or not it's ethical, because it doesn't have any bearing on anything we've already discussed in terms of this debate. That said, given that we also discussed how the large companies and production studios are disproportionately profiting off of fan art's creation, I get it. Is it ethical to sell fan art of a massive company that has expressly prohibited that sale, even if it's like Nintendo and there's no way you as a small artist are in any way near their competitor on a fundamental level? Still, probably not. Would I feel bad about doing it anyway? Not even a little bit. Artistic License offers an interesting proposal in response to the ethical sale of fan art, comparing it to the music industry stance on covers. Individuals making covers of existing songs obviously could not be doing so without the original songs they're covering having already been made, but their interpretations of them are still their own. As a result, should they wish to sell or otherwise derive income from those covers, they have to pay certain royalties to the original artist. Artistic License suggest that in an ideal world, visual derivative works like fan art would be subject to a similar stipulation, with a portion of the earnings derived from each piece of fan art going to the owner of the original source material. Some creators and companies are in fact already going this route, offering fan artists the opportunity to purchase a license to sell fan art of their work, which is very promising to see. So we're finally at the end. Is it ethical to sell fan art? Well, these are just my opinions, and since ethics can't be universally or quantifiably defined, I can't say definitively one way or the other. But based on all of my research and personal contemplation, I believe that the sale of fan art is ethical if the following conditions are met. It's not against the express wishes of the original creator, it's not a commercial competitor, a market undercutting substitute as Artistic License puts it, and it's not a mass-produced large-scale operation with the sale of fan art being the entire basis of the business. As I stated at the beginning, I do make and sell fan art myself, both on prints and apparel, but only if the original creator whose work it's based on has either confirmed that they're alright with that or has not expressed a preference one way or the other. I also agree completely with Artistic License's proposal for an ideal solution, and would happily pay the original creators of the source material of my fan art a licensing or royalty fee if a system were created to facilitate that, because I believe that fan art is an inherently collaborative practice in which both original artist and fan artist play significant roles that both should be compensated for. But what do you guys think? This is an incredibly nuanced debate, so I'm genuinely very interested to hear from you all on this one, because I'm sure opinions will differ greatly. Let me know in the comments, and if you end up debating amongst yourselves, please do remember to be respectful. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Josu Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak 42, King Good James, Art of Amethyst Fable, Scourge the Cat 67, and Haruki Kenway, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle O, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Elengshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gintong, Grayson Xavier, MG, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Allura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Captain Reku, Catbus, Alec Reinakainen, Mac, and Lucy Amajiki, and I'll see you in the next one.